Hello, welcome to Miniature Realms. My name's Stuart, and today is another painting tutorial for the Old World or Warhammer Fantasy or whatever iteration you prefer. Those of you who have watched a few of these now will know that it's turned into a little series, and today's turn is Empire State Troops, or Free Guild if you know them only from their Age of Sigmar iterations. Because they're available in Age of Sigmar, you can still purchase these on the Games Workshop website and other hobby stores, but I managed to pick up a few for a future project via a friend actually, but I'd seen them on eBay first. This was a painting video I've had planned for a little while, and I really wanted to tackle a white and red scheme. I've had a few requests, but overall red and white schemes seem to be the order of the day. So I looked at Reichland as a potential, but it is very heavily white. Then it always falls back to Talabheim, which is the kind of poster boys of many of the Games Workshop armies, and a really nice spread of different red and white. And I thought that this tutorial would be a good way to explain how I like to paint those, especially white, because I know some people find it tricky. So I started the miniature by priming black and then a very heavy zenithal white, and it's incredibly heavy zenithal white. On the image here on the screen, it looks just like a white prime miniature. There is a little bit of black showing in the undercuts, but it does get bleached out by the lighting a little bit that I use for filming and painting. I've also added a dry brush after as well to really create some edges on the details of the miniature. Again, this doesn't show up too well at this stage of the video. But essentially what I'm trying to do is create a really nice base of which I can glaze my base layers down using mostly contrast paints, but also some Army Painter speed paints and some Vallejo Express colour. This is a method I seem to be using for many of my projects these days, and I find it a really pleasing way to paint. And the preparation gives you a really nice kind of base layer, which does give you a subtle highlight and shade as already as it is, and then it's easy to highlight on top as much as you wish to do so. So first up, I am starting with a Vallejo Express colour, and this is Dwarf Skin. I always call it Dwarf Skin, who knows, and I keep mentioning this as well in videos. At some point that's going to get boring. But I'm applying this liberally over all of the flesh area, so in this miniature's case it's the face and the hands. And that gives a pleasing effect by itself, but I'm just going to add a little bit more depth to it, and I'm using some deep purple also from Express Colour, and that is just thin 50% with water. I'm just placing this over the knuckles, over the nose, over parts of the chin, and it really gives you a nice skin effect that you could leave as is. Then to further add to that, I'm using Express Colour Gloomy Violet, and this is a really good shade for that. It's not really subtle on this. I'm just placing this at the top of where the cuff of the top meets the hand, and also underneath the edge of the helmet rim, or just adds a little bit of extra shadow in there. You can very much leave this stage off if you wanted to keep it more simple. Now we move on to the first main bulk colour of the miniature, and I'm using Contrast Blood Angels Red, and this is a really lovely rich red colour that goes on very smoothly, and this is why I love using this process to base coat. It's much easier to get a smooth finish than it would be just using normal paints. Now there's quite a few red areas, and you got lots of different variations of placement for these, so I'm filling these in with this little rough area on the knee here. So I want that side of the leg to be white, but I want the inner material to be red, so I'm just very gently painting those bits in first, but later on I will move on and start painting red in other areas. Going for a sort of quartered effect on this miniature, so I'm very careful when I paint in a straight line where the white would meet the red. I'm only doing this in two places, so this will be the front of the and back of the trousers, sort of on the groin areas, and then there's an area on the back of his top, which also requires that sort of steady hand, but it's fairly easy to do with these contrast paints. They've got a lot of control. Then, having covered all areas of the clothing, I decided to use red on the feathers while I had the red paint out, and it would make sense to have one white and one red feather also. Now we're on to the whites, and I'm holding two paints here, so Contrast Apothecary White, and then there's the Vallejo Express Colour White as well. Now, I'm using the Express Colour here. I wanted to show both because they are very, very, very similar. I just think the tone of the Express Colour is just slightly better for what I need for this particular job. But if you've only got the one or the other, I wouldn't rush out and try and replace it. They're very, very close in what they do. Sometimes it's worth thinning slightly. I'm using the Express Colour here, which is a little bit thinner than the Contrast, and I'm applying this as a very, very light glaze. I don't want to oversaturate the miniature here. I do want the colour to sit in the recesses because it provides a really, really good shading effect there. So you do want to make sure that it hangs there in the lines, but I also don't want it to pool too much on the flatter areas, and if it does so, I clean my brush and just go back over and wipe it off the surface. Now, in order to achieve this white effect, as I'd already mentioned, the Zenithal pre-highlight was extremely heavy, almost fully white, and if you don't have an airbrush, I wouldn't recommend going down the route of a black prime and then a white dry brush over the top for this particular miniature. I would just go straight to a white prime, otherwise you won't get that smooth white finish that you're really after. So next up, some Contrast Black Legion. This is the slightly darker, more brown toned of the two blacks that Citadel do. I could go with brown shoes. You could even mix them up within the unit. In fact, that's something I'll probably do if I get round to painting the rest of the unit and stick to this state. But these give you a nice little subtle highlight over this sort of lighter prepared model. But when I've added some basing materials, including some pigments later on, that the shoes will be perfect and you don't need to go back and do any highlighting on them, which saves you loads of time. Now on to Contrast Garagax Sewer, which is one of my favourite contrast paints at the moment and seems to be my go-to for all things leather. And it just gives you a really, really nice sort of mid-tone brown with that little subtle highlight that you get from the contrast effect. I'm picking out the scabbards of the little daggers and also their hilts as well. And then there's a belt and some strapping holding his armour on. Now for some Contrast Skeleton Horde, and I'm going to be using this on what looks like it could be some kind of tabard or tie around his waist, or even parchment like. I looked at the reference pictures for the studio paint jobs and they seem to be painted in this kind of colour. It's quite hard to make out on this miniature. It's a little bit of a mess under there. I didn't build this miniature came pre-built, so it's quite hard to see what it is, but it definitely seems to match what the other miniatures have, but a lot of it's hidden underneath his belt and armour anyway. It's just a bit sticking out under his right side. Now for some scale colour black metal. So this is scale 75 essentially range of metallics. They are brilliant, really, really low in terms of the metal content, so it's not big and chunky, it doesn't sort of dry out. They go on very, very smoothly and thin very well to go through the airbrush. If you haven't tried them out, they are the best metallics I've ever used in terms of versatility between a hairy brush and airbrush, and I just love the colours that they do. But I'm using this to base on all the metallic areas. So you've got a breastplate, you've got his helmet, and also going to paint the entire spear with it. Now while I was waiting for that to dry before I could put any washes on, I decided to whack on the earth texture for the base. This is Vallejo European mud, and it's just perfect to create the base for most types of mud and things around. So by the time I'd placed that on, the metallics had dried enough for me to add the shade, and I'm using a Nuln oil for that. And this is the new formulation. I quite like this stuff. It doesn't pool and dull the metals as much as the older version did. I'm still trying not to apply this too thick, apart from around the kind of the little notches and things where I do want it to pool. So trying to be a little bit careful with it, not just slapping it on, but you know, at the end of the day, it's a shade and it's fairly easy to use. Now to start highlighting the red, and I'm using Citadel Colour Layer Evil Sun's Scarlet, which is a perfect bedfellow to the Blood Angels Contrast Red. So first of all, I'm just kind of filling in the higher areas, not completely. I want to leave some of those darker tones. It just gives you that nice subtle first layer. So picking out the lines of the miniature a little bit there, so the shape of the knee, a little flat area where the sun would catch, or the light would catch on the top of the thigh, and working my way around the miniature. So you've got the red half of his top as well, and you've also got the feathers. Not forgetting the fabric that goes around the top of the helmet, and when I get to the feathers themselves, I'm just using the flat edge of the brush rather than dry brushing. You could use a small dry brush as well, but the flat end of the brush in order just to pick out the edges of the feather, and it's a little bit of a cleaner way of doing it. And then an optional further highlight is a 50-50 mix of Evil Sun Scarlet and Wild Rider Red. And again, just an even thinner line here, almost a line highlight, picking out the very most top areas, and it just makes that red pop even more. And if you want to, you could just go in with pure Wild Rider Red afterwards for some really, really fine top highlights. All of this is optional. You could have stopped at the contrast stage and it would still look pretty good. Now back to the white, and I'm actually using Model Air here, and this is their standard white. It matches very well with the off-white for standard model colour. You could use either. The reason I'm going for Air here is because it's pretty much thinned to the perfect consistency already. Painting with white is hard. What makes it hard, first of all, is people often start from white, just the way I've done it here. But starting from white and you can't shade down, so you put a wash on it and it gets messy. Now contrast has changed that a little bit. The contrast paints, or the express colour paints, have given us a way of half glazing, half shading a white area and giving it that kind of greyish tone which you highlight up from. The old-fashioned way of doing white really well would be to start from a cream or a white, or a cream or a grey base rather, and build it up. And this is essentially at the stage we're at now, and so a nice thin white paint that's not too dry and chalky. And I'm sorry, Citadel paints, this is where you let us down, and why I don't use Citadel whites very often at all. And just building up, just like I did with the red, so starting on those higher areas, thin lines, filling in some of the areas completely, other areas just doing a thin line, and it just really, really kind of makes that white pop, but you're still trying to leave some of that grey shaded area there. So go around, take your time, build it up slowly. Worst case scenario, you put a bit too much on, and you can always just add a little bit of the apothecary white or the express colour white back in, and it will just glaze it back. So you can't really mess this up if you take your time. And then I went around the model making sure I didn't miss anything, including the feather, which I did the same way as the red, just using the edge of the brush. To highlight the leather areas that were base coated in Garrick Sewer, I'm using Model Colour Flat Earth. Just working my way methodically around the miniature, picking out any of those leather areas. I've decided not to go for the highlight top and bottom of the belt kind of effect. I'm doing a thicker central line. This is a miniature to go in a unit, so I'm not going to spend too much time on those things. If I do make a mistake, I can always go back in with the Garrick Sewer again and just sort of dull it back down, or tidy up any bits where I cover a shaded area. So now just to add a subtle highlight to the skin, there's a pretty good base level for it already with the process we've used, so I don't want to do too much, but I'm using a mix of basic skin from Model Colour and the Vallejo Express Colour medium. You can use any medium here. I just find this paint slightly chalky, so I find the medium does a better job of thinning it and making it go on smoothly than water. Just picking out the tops of the knuckles, the nose, the cheekbones, and maybe a bit on the chin as well. Now just quickly adding in the eyes, I'm using a Model Air here as well. The white has good control for the reasons I mentioned earlier on, and then Model Air Black as well. Similar reasons, it's perfect for dotting on eyes without it being too gloopy. Now to highlight the metal areas, I'm moving on to Game Air Silver, which is a really nice bright silver. I'm going to do a mixture of light dry brushing and stippling and a little bit of overbrushing on different parts of the armour. I can always tone it back with a little bit of non-oil or Agrax Earthshade later if I wish to. Make sure you don't forget to pick out the extra tiny bits of metal, like on the dagger's hilt and on the ends of their little scabbards. So at this stage, the basing texture is fully dry, and I'm able to add a liberal layer of Agrax Earthshade ready for later. And while the Agrax Earthshade is open, I just add it to a few areas of the armour to add a little bit of colour variation and make it not look quite so parade ground. With the Agrax Earthshade dry on the base, I add in a little bit of light sienna pigment from Vallejo. Again, I'm brushing this in dry, getting it into the crevices of the base texture, and then I'll blow the excess off. I don't seal it, it doesn't need to be doing with the way I'm working with it. It varies very little on the surface, it just tones it and makes it look a little bit more realistic than just dry brushing. Then after that, it's time to add a few tufts. And then on to the final stage of the basing, I'm using some Vallejo thick mud. This is European mud, and I've talked about this before in other tutorials. It seems to be my go-to. The thicker you apply it, the wetter it looks once it's dry, if that makes any sense. And I like to put this over the tufts and things as well to really make it look like the army's marched over it and churn the ground up a little bit. And then finish off the base with the obligatory black rim. Other colours are available. There we have one finished Empire State Troop in the Talabheim covers. I picked these because they had more requests than the others, but it's also probably visually my favourite, and these are two of my favourite colours to paint. But they are useful colours for other people to use across different state troops and across different armies and things as well. The method for white is super simple and easy, and it's definitely made white paintable for people that struggle with it before. And I think from this tutorial you could easily transfer this to Reichland or any of the other states that use red or white quite predominantly, which a lot of them do, and it may be you're swapping out a blue or a green or something like that. I was pretty pleased with the way the miniatures come out, especially for the time taken. It probably took me 2 hours to paint while recording the video, so that always adds time. If I'm batch painting, I could get through a unit of these in a reasonable enough time, I think. It's still not super quick, but again, if you want that, you can do this without painting all the highlights in that I did, but I do find it hard to leave them out. Please do keep sending in your requests for further subjects in this little series of miniatures. The only thing I'm saying at the moment is I'd like to stick to sort of standard warriors, like the core troops of armies for now. I may move on to more things in the future. I am now forming a small list from people sending things in. I have a Skaven miniature that I purchased from eBay lined up to do a similar video at some point soon. And I also, I think, have Wood Elves on the request list, so I might have to try and purchase a single miniature online there because I don't have any Wood Elves. But I'm excited to kind of keep doing these one-off videos. It's really fun painting these miniatures. Now I will have an Empire armor myself. I'm not sure if it's going to be this particular state. Even though I do like these colours, we will wait and see what the release of the Old World game brings and what the lore brings with that, because it will well and truly be out by the time I get around to painting and starting an Empire force when I'm still working on my Bretonnians now. And while I've already painted a Highlands miniature skeleton, I'm trying to get my hands on some reasonably priced Tomb Kings so that I can maybe paint a whole unit or at least a single miniature. With that release coming, it seems to be a prudent thing to do, and no doubt once I purchase what seems to be a starter box including them and the Bretonnians, I will no doubt want to paint the Tomb Kings as well. So it'll be a fun little project and probably a timely one to do soon as well. If you enjoyed the video, please do give us a like, it helps me out loads, and check out the other videos on the channel and subscribe if you haven't already. I'd love to see more people watching the videos and getting involved in the channel, whether it's through the comments or replying to the posts on social media. Thank you very much for taking the time to watch the video. I'm really enjoying doing these, and I will definitely be bringing you lots more. Take care, and I'll catch you soon.